Good morning. Very recently, the RBA Governor Philip Lowe expressed some reluctance about negative interest rates, so taking official rates below zero, following some other countries that have done just that. Imagine that, negative interest rates. And yet, Westpac's chief economist has said maybe they should consider it. We'll take a look at that notion, that rather strange notion, in just a moment here on ABC Illawarra. Quickly, Andrew's called in, I think, welcoming the news about a potential stimulus package for the construction sector, possibly in the way of renovation grants for homeowners. Andrew, g'day. Why do you think it's good news?
G'day, g'day. I think it is. I'm a free apprentice at the moment, and looking for an apprenticeship as a mature age apprentice, as difficult as it is.
Oh, sorry, Andrew,
Add in
your
the
line's
fact
really
that-
bad. Just 1 second, you said you were a mature age apprentice, is that right? Oh, and we've lost Andrew. We're having a bit of trouble with the phones this morning. I think Andrew was saying he was a mature age apprentice, and he was thinking that would be good news for him. Any kind of boost to the sector at the moment in these difficult times. It's coming up to 21 minutes to 8. Yes, Bill Evans has said, the chief economist at Westpac, that possibly negative interest rates would be a good thing for Australia, taking the official cost of money into negative territory. Does this work? Is it a good idea? All sorts of, at one time thought to be outlandish ideas are being considered by governments. Martin North is a local financial analyst with Digital Finance Analytics and joins me now. Martin North, good morning.
G'day.
Negative interest rates. It's a bit of a mind-bending concept, but lots of countries are moving into that sort of territory now. What do you think about it as a strategy?
Well, it's one of those things that a few years ago you'd have said would never happen. I think you've got to now say it might happen. And it's worth just underscoring there's a difference between retail rates, in other words, what you and I might pay on a mortgage or get for a deposit account, and what the wholesale rates are, in other words, the plumbing, the financial plumbing between major companies in the Reserve Bank and other central banks around the world. What Bill has said is that there is a chance that rate, the central bank rate, could go negative, but it doesn't necessarily translate to retail deposits or mortgages, becoming inverted, as it were.
Okay,
but
so we're not talking about banks paying us to lend us money.
Well, not initially. But if you look around the world, and I think the ECB is probably the best one to look at, they started with this idea of saying, let's take rates lower so that we encourage large companies not to just give money to us to hold and get very little return or no return, but actually actively invest it. So they're trying to actively invest, actually encourage large companies to invest. That was the cornerstone. But it's now deteriorated to the point where, in fact, some banks in Germany are now charging depositors to hold money with them. And in some Scandinavian countries, mortgages are now negative. So the risk is that you start with the intention of effectively manipulating the wholesale rates, but it can spill over into retail rates. And here's the other point. The IMF wrote a paper last year saying, if you really want to make the degree of stimulus that we had with the global financial crisis and drop cash rates 4 to 5%, you'd have to take rates deeply negative. And if that were the case, then boy, we would be in a whole new world.
Yeah, it would be a disaster for many retirees. Look, we've spoken before about the various levers that the RBA, the Reserve Bank, has at its disposal. There's been a lot of talk about Philip Lowe himself being very honest about the fact, very upfront about the fact that there's not much left available to them. We've spoken about this on the program before as well. How likely do you think it is, given that putting rates into negative territory really is what a last resort for the RBA?
Yeah, it's unlikely, I think, in the short term. I mean, the Federal Reserve has said we're not going to do it. The Bank of Canada said they're not going to do it. And Phil Lowe has said it's very, very unlikely that we're going to do it here. And by the way, it's worth saying the 0.25% cash rate, which is the one that we are aware of, the real rate at the moment between large institutions and the central bank is close to zero anyway. So I don't think there's much more wriggle room for the bank unless they change strategy, which means that they have to then put more of the acid back on the government in terms of fiscal stimulus. But, we are in a diabolical situation because we've got no real rates at all, is close to zero. And yet inflation is well below the target band that the Reserve Bank has always aspired to. And so the question is, well, what else do you do? And maybe you can get some fiscal stuff happening. But now we've got an exchange rate at 65, 66, which means that we're not going to get an inflation import from a good exchange rate, as it were. So the question is, are there other options there, or are we actually stuck into this corner, into this blind alley, where in fact negative rates start to look interesting?
And we find ourselves in this weird situation where everything us simpletons know about economics doesn't seem to be applying. For example, that huge government borrowings will lead to high inflation.
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question. My own view is I'm very skeptical of that. I think that actually people with, school economics actually probably has a better feel on things.
Thanks,
than,
Martin.
frankly, some of the central people. No, seriously. I mean, it is that serious insofar that, we've got a range of unusual circumstances, but I actually think they've lost the plot. I think that they've got this quantitative easing, take rates lower and everything will be fine. School of thinking. Remember that if you increase debt, you have to repay debt later at some point. And so I think we have to stand back and take a really careful look at how this whole thing is playing out, because we could actually end up with a disaster, not just for a few years, but for much longer if we're not very careful.
But do you think some of those economic ideas are being turned on their head? Are we going to look differently about things like government debt into the future and things like interest rates and things like the power of the Reserve Bank, infrastructure as stimulus, all that sort of thing?
Well, I do think there's a question about, the power of the Reserve Bank, the accountability of the Reserve Bank. They really have a really free hand to do what they want without necessarily, I think, the degree of accountability. And there is a school of thought that says, look, with interest rates so low, governments can borrow big, and, that means that we can invest in things for the future. And that's true, if they invest in the right things. The problem I see is that the government could well throw more money at the housing sector and inflate housing prices, rather than, for example, build infrastructure that could actually set us up for a generation. So it's partly a question of what you do with the money. If you can actually invest the money from a government perspective in things that are going to create more growth later, then that's good. But if you just simply inflate housing prices once again, which is probably what they're going to do, then we're going to go round the loop once again and not necessarily end up with a better state.
We're expecting announcements on that imminently. Martin North, thanks very much for your thoughts this morning.
Good to talk to you.
That's Martin North. It's News Time.